Okay, so here we are again with Riane Eisler, and this is our second part of our interview, and we're talking about empathy and empathy and caring, how they relate. You know, we're kind of going over the domination society, and I want to go in a little bit more into empathy and caring, how the two relate, because in my quest of kind of understanding society and values, I've seen empathy as this core social value, and you're talking about caring as this core social value. And for me, I think we're actually on the same page here. We're actually talking about the same qualities. I'm wondering how do you see that with empathy and caring?
I think you're right that we are on the same page. And I think that you can feel empathy in terms of being able to identify with what the other is feeling. But unfortunately, that in itself does not guarantee that there will be caring. So we are to some extent on the same page, because I don't think that caring is really possible without some empathy. On the other hand, empathy alone is not enough. And there have actually been studies of psychopaths showing that some of the brain areas involved, you know, whether we call them mirror neurons, you know, there's a lot of controversy right now as to whether it's mirror neurons or other brain regions, but that they are capable of really understanding what the other is feeling, but it doesn't make any difference. On the contrary, they really enjoy inflicting pain. So caring...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So caring is the key, and that is very much really a matter of learning whether, I mean, you know, if you have genes that make somebody a psychopath, and who knows, I mean, there may be some genetic component here, that may be that. But for most people, there is the capacity for both empathy and caring, as the experiment with the toddlers, the Max Planck experiment we spoke about in an earlier session, indicates, and also other experiments indicate. For example, we know from neuroscience, and this is fascinating, that the pleasure centers of the brain light up more when people give rather than when they win. Okay? Well, giving is a way of caring, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So caring for me is the key, and the issue then always becomes, is that inhibited, compartmentalized by the culture? Is it associated with a subordinate, feminine way of being, right? You know, women are supposed to be caring, but men are supposed to be tough. Which is part of the domination system values we've inherited.
So it's like a whole cultural framework there that these values are kind of being filtered through, in a sense.
They're not only being filtered through, but they are being taught to children even before their brains are fully developed. Because, you know, we know from neuroscience that the human brain takes a long time to fully develop. What connections, synapses are formed, which ones are not formed. That really is very, very much dependent on what a child observes or experiences, in other words, learning. And that's where the importance of the configuration of the domination system, whether it's Eastern or Western, Southern or Northern, rightist or leftist, capitalist or socialist, and so on, comes in versus the configuration of the partnership system. And I want to say something very important here. By partnership system, I do not mean just working together. People work together all the time in domination systems. You know, monopolies work together, terrorists work together, invading armies work together. Nor does it mean a completely flat organization. There are hierarchies, but we need a whole new vocabulary. So I've coined the terms of hierarchies of domination. We all know those. You know, you better obey orders,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, in a very rigid domination system, you're killed, right? Uh, or, you know, or else, I mean, terrible suffering, or a hierarchy of actualization, where accountability, respect, benefit doesn't just flow from the bottom up, but both ways. And where power, and this is really goes back to the title of my book, The Chalice and the Blade, where power is not symbolized by the blade, you know, that's the power, right? To
Mm-hmm.
dominate, to destroy, to take life, but by the chalice, which since prehistory really has been associated with the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. And the fact that we're today talking about leaders and managers empowering others shows that, at least in some world regions and in some culture, you know, aspects of our culture, we're moving to the partnership side. So we don't have to start from square one, really. But
Yeah,
there
if
are
I could just, no, if I just mention, you're talking about, you know, what type of working together, and that's something that relates with change. I hear change. Well, we have to do change all the time. And for me, it's like, what kind of a change? Is it an empathic change, or is it a, you know, a domination change? Because everybody's talking about change. So having that clarity about what type of change we're wanting, I think, is really important. Or what kind of collaboration? Is it a domination collaboration, or is it a, I call it empathic, or you're saying caring collaboration?
Well, you know, I'm so glad you brought that point up, because change is a constant. You know, I mean, plants grow and they die. We humans, you know, age and we die. Social systems change. The question is, as you said, what direction will the change take? And that's where human agency comes in, because cultures are human creations, economic systems, values. They really are functions of what we humans want to be the governing rules and values. So in my most recent book, The Real Wealth of Nations, the subtitle is Creating a Caring Economics, I really take that on about our job is not just to have alternatives on the margins, as important as these are, because they are models, aren't they, for more partnership orienting, and many of them, some of them are not. But that our job is to see to it that we change the structures and the rules of the game. And that's why we at the Center for Partnership Studies have launched our Caring Economy campaign. And why we are working on what we call social wealth economic indicators, which really measure what GDP leaves out. The enormous, not only human and environmental value, but economic value of the work of caring for people starting in early childhood and caring for our natural environment. And I invite viewers to go to caringeconomy.org. We just had a briefing in Washington, D.C., a congressional briefing on this, and I invite you to join the Caring Economy Coalition. And also, we have a wonderful online Caring Economy Leadership Training Program. So check that out. We also have other online classes, by the way, and I am now giving a class on cultural transformation, just what you're talking about, fundamental change from domination to partnership, which we're winding down now. It's the third of 4 sessions, but I'll be doing it again soon, so check that out too. And the
So
point
there's
that
a
you
lot of, oh, if I can just interrupt here, there's a lot of resources about your overall vision. I mean, it's just incredibly well articulated and laid out. I mean, especially in your book, you know. The one thing I thought we could maybe spend a little bit more time on is on the relationship of empathy and compassion, since, you know, the work I'm doing is so focused on really exploring the nature of empathy. And what I was hearing, and I wanted to mention about, you know, you're saying that you know, a psychopath can have empathy, and that one problem we have is like a problem with definitions and understandings, that there's so many different definitions of empathy. And I thought maybe I could just lay out kind of a definition of empathy that I'm using, just to get your response to that.
please.
If that would work. So, this is like, you know, I've talked to a lot of people, a lot of the experts, you know, academics about empathy, and I've been trying to put it together into kind of a model that what I call is the wheel of empathy, the wheel and feel of empathy. So it begins with what I would call self-empathy, which is sensory awareness of just what's going on inside of ourselves. So, you know, practices like yoga, mindfulness, whatever, just get us more in tune with the felt sense that's inside of our body. And then is where, if we're fearful, you know, our body constricts and we don't kind of take in so much, you know, from others and outside. But when we're open, you know, kind of connected to ourselves and aware, that we're open for what I call mirrored empathy, which is through mirror neurons, that when we see an action and do an action, the same neurons fire. So as my hands kind of wave here, and you see my hands wave, you know, your neurons are also firing, and you can kind of feel the level of enthusiasm, you know, kind of what's going on with me. You can really kind of feel a sense of my emotional state, as well as maybe my intentions as well, through that mirrored empathy. If you were highly fearful, you might not, you know, really feel and be attuned. Then the next part of empathy is an imaginative empathy. The academics call it perspective taking or cognitive empathy, which is that as we see that we're separate beings and have that sense of self-awareness, we realize that someone can have a different perspective from our perspective. And that's kind of where that metaphor of, you know, looking through someone else's eyes, standing in someone else's shoes kind of come in, that we can kind of put ourselves in their position and, you know, kind of like an actor take on the role of how it would be to be that person. With that, the fourth part would be empathic creativity or action, that when we really attune to each other, that we're kind of like those little kids you were talking about, who see someone in need, you know, that they care about, and they want to, it's almost like an automatic instinctual desire to contribute to their well-being that just kind of arises. And so that's kind of like a framework, a wheel, a model of empathy. And then there's the feel of empathy. Just what does it feel like in your body when you kind of resonate and feel someone else? And so when you're talking about the psychopath has empathy, what the psychopath has is the has that kind of cognitive empathy. And I've interviewed a psychopath who says, you know, for him, empathy is like a dry library full of facts and books, that there's like no humanity in it, that they've got this model of how things work, and they're just thinking about themselves. They're not really having that felt sense of the other and really wanting to contribute with empathy, you know, contribute to their well-being. So I'm just kind of wondering how that kind of model kind of works.
Well, I think it's a very good model. I would add some things to it.
Yeah.
Going back to the mindfulness, you know, children who grow up in dominator families really cannot be mindful because it's too painful. I mean, the people who say they love them and who demand the children's love are hurting them, are humiliating them. So you cannot be mindful. You what these kids very often tend to do then is to identify, I mean, the experiments show this, by the way. Else Frankel Brunswick's work goes way back. They identify with the punitive power figure, right? Which is then, of course, taken over into how they vote. So it's not coincidental that in societies, for example, in much of the Middle East, in Egypt, in Gaza, where you still have a very rigid dominator family, people will vote for Hamas or for the Muslim Brotherhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just what they're used to. Democracy doesn't necessarily mean what we think it ought to mean. Okay? And there are many people in our culture, in the Western culture, still subcultures, that do that. As I said, they have no trouble finding money for these, control, for prisons, for weapons, for wars, but somehow they can't find money for the soft, for the stereotypically feminine, for the caring. So I would start.
Could I just reflect what I'm hearing so far? Is that there's people, if in a dominator society, that you're kind of cut off from your sense of connection. So as a child is growing up in that environment, they can't really attune to their own self because they're kind of like cut off from connection with.
Well, it's because it's too painful to recognize that these people who are being so awful to them are not. I mean, the kid blames herself or himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And has to suppress the anger, has to suppress. Because, they depend on these people to survive, for goodness sakes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing I'd add. But going all the way over to some of the other aspects, I think that in domination systems, what you often find is not only the suppression of empathy, but the compartmentalization of empathy. So people feel empathy for their in-group. Okay? But they don't feel empathy. I mean, how could you feel empathy? Say you're in a Southeast Asian family where boys are fed more than little girls, okay? I mean, it's just a fact. They do it. Less health care, less food, etc., okay? Certainly less education. How can you feel empathy for that little girl then? You see what I'm saying? And mothers, are so identified with those in control, namely men and the male preference, that they will compartmentalize their empathy and they'll even sell that little girl into sexual slavery so that they can get an education for their son.
So you're what you're addressing is we have this empathy. There's things that can suppress the empathy, or like you can shut down the empathy. It can be from you're explaining why if you're in a domination society, so you're not seen, you feel maybe alone and painful, and that you kind of end up that your own self connection gets suppressed as well.
I'm not so sure. That it is just your own self-connection. This is the point I'm trying to make. I think that children in these families do learn to really go into denial, okay, about what's really happening. It's justified, well, she's just a girl or whatever, or they're just Jews and therefore it's okay if we wipe Israel off the map, etc., okay? Or vice versa, where we can deny here when we, go to war against a country, that there's evidence that we shouldn't have, as happened with the war in Iraq. But the thing about it is that it isn't just lack of connection with yourself. It's a pattern acquired early on by the brain. That's the point that I'm trying to make. That's why I said I'd like to add to your model.
Yeah.
These two things. I mean, one, what happens in childhood, what they observe or what they experience, and two, that it isn't just the suppression of empathy, it's the compartmentalization so that you can feel it for some but not for others. I mean, you've heard about so-called compassionate conservatives, who have a lot of empathy for people in their in-group, but somehow don't seem to have it for those so-called exploitive welfare mothers, you know, these women who basically are trying very hard to feed themselves and their children, right?
Yeah, so so that empathy can be blocked and be kept to your in-group, and it's not going to those, you know, who are kind of outside of that in-group.
That's right.
So the question for me is that's why I call it a culture of empathy, because for me the culture of empathy is to expand that empathic connection with everyone and nature.
But that's another element that I think I would really urge you to put in. What is really the cultural message about empathy and caring? And if you still value the stereotypically, and I emphasize stereotypically, has nothing to do with anything inherent in women or men, but if real men are supposed to, above all things, not to be like a woman, and empathy, caring, sensitivity is associated with the so-called inferior feminine, then you've had it, haven't you? And even women will then really devalue empathy and caring.
Yeah, so it's like, how do we have men? Yeah, it's a cultural kind of demeaning of empathy, that men have to be strong and kind of closed off and not empathize, and there's like this cultural norm. And it's really, for me, it's like, how do we, you know, change that norm? Because, you know, men, I think, are just as capable as women of being empathic. If we just kind of nurture those values and support it.
And some women are not empathic. They will not be empathic to the outgroup. They've been taught that. And they will even identify, I mean, look at the Phyllis Schlaflys.
Yeah.
I mean, or the Sarah Palins. They do everything to distance themselves from this stereotypically feminine stuff, right? So we really, again, as I say, it's not men against women or women against men. It's about, look, if you rank male and so-called masculine over female and so-called feminine, then you really have a culture where caring, empathy, nonviolence, which are stereotypically associated not with those in control, okay, but with the subordinates, it will not be valued, and it will not be part of social and economic policy. And that's really what I'm working on, is to make this what's been invisible, because people don't like to talk about gender, right? We're uncomfortable. But let's remember what the great sociologist Philip Worth said. I mean, Lewis Worth, excuse me. He said that the most important things about a society are those that people are uncomfortable talking about. We saw it about race. We started to talk about it. Things started to move a little bit forward. And we see it with gender, so we've got to talk much more about gender. And that's what I'm suggesting to you, that you weave that into your model.
Well, for me, yeah, with the gender part, I see values as like trans, you know, going beyond gender. That, you know, I don't see, I mean, I know the culture itself is saying, you know, men should not be so empathic, and women, that empathy is this women, but it doesn't seem to me that that's accurate. The accuracy is that we're all capable, equally capable of empathy.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Forgive me for interrupting. I think
please.
you're mishearing me. I am not saying that men are not capable of it. I am saying that if we don't look at what exists now, which is a gendered system of values, if we don't deconstruct that and make it visible, then we can talk about caring and empathy all we want, but we are not going to change the dynamic. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so how do you see changing that dynamic? Because I have a story, like, in my family is that evangelical Christian, you know, fundamentalist environment that I grew up, and, you know, kind of growing up in that whole environment. And for me, during the 60s, I kind of became the rebel, standing up, getting influenced by the 60s and so forth. And then I did a lot of traveling, which really led me down a different path, and then seeing the importance of empathy. And I used to be in conflict all the time with my family, right? But now I just try to empathize with them, because it's like I found I can't fight them because it doesn't work. All I'm doing is nurturing that way of being. And now I just empathize with them. And I mean, it's like there's this real connection kind of happening, that we need to do what it is that we want, kind of, be the change. If I want an empathic culture, I got to try to empathize with them. And it's been, it's actually been working. It's really quite amazing.
Well, I think it does work. I would say this, though. I'm not a subscriber to cultural relativism, and I think that we always have to have human rights standards. To just have no standards, and I'm not saying that you don't, because you obviously do. Mm-hmm. So I would separate your relationship with your family from your position about the culture, which is a dominator culture.
Mm-hmm.
Because certainly, if you make people defensive, they're just going to hang on more. But there are some people, such as you, who, when they are exposed to another possibility other than dominating or being dominated, right, which is the old,
mm-hmm.
Dominator way, who flourish. And so you want to do both. You want to expose maybe some of the younger ones to another possibility.
Yeah, I really hear you on the relativism, because I'm like, I don't go subscribe to that either, because the relativism says, oh, everything's okay, and it's just kind of, it doesn't really matter, the attitude. But I'm coming at it from, I am firmly standing for empathy as a social value. I am here, I am present, I am standing for empathy. I don't believe in relativism, which is just kind of like an indifference of sort. That I am firmly, committed to fostering empathy, and that we need to actually transform the whole social structure to be supportive of empathy, which is kind of what your work, very, very systems thinking work is about.
Absolutely, and my work is global. Mm-hmm. And I want to say one last thing, which is that we have, of course, as I said, as a major project of the Center for Partnership Studies, the Caring Economy campaign, but we also have our work to really end traditions of violence against women and children in families. Why? Because what do children learn? They learn, when they observe or experience that violence, that it's all right, it's acceptable and even moral to use violence to impose your will on mm-hmm. others. So I invite you and our audience to go to another website, which is partnershipway.org, and look for the Spiritual Alliance to Stop Intimate Violence. And why a spiritual alliance? Because unfortunately, so much in earlier, more dominator-oriented religious tradition has condoned and even commanded violence against women and children, right? So it's very important that spiritual leaders, religious leaders in particular, but other spiritual leaders as well, like the Dalai Lama, I would love to get to take a strong stand against this intimate violence. Because frankly, as I have said, intimate violence and national and international violence are as tightly bound together as the fingers of a clenched fist. Mm-hmm. And again, if children learn this, we're not going to have that more peaceful, empathic world. Because how can you have empathy, really, if you either stand by, accept, condone, or inflict mm-hmm. That kind of pain, even death?
Yeah, those actions are not empathic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I urge you to also consider these matters. And I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Riane. It's a wonderful chatting with you and kind of exploring this topic. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time. I know you're like super busy and you have so many things you're doing. And so thank you for taking this time to chat with me and our audience.
It's been a pleasure, and I really want to congratulate you on the important work that you're doing.
And likewise, I hope we keep the conversation going as well. It's we can always do more of these or do some panels or something online if that opportunity arises. Now that we've got it all set up, so thank you very much.
My pleasure.